Welcome to Hacking Health, a podcast where spirituality and science merge to better the lives of our listeners. I'm Waylon Gomez, I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about meditation. What actually is meditation, and have many of us ever even really and truly meditated? I know that for a lot of people, meditation is one of those things that sometimes freaking sucks. We sit down to it, we know it's good for us, we know we should do it. We sit down on our, rattan, we sit down on our pillow, we put on some music, and we just cannot seem to meditate. The thoughts run into our mind, we can't seem to shut them up, and the whole time, the only thing we're thinking is, why am I even doing this? Well, part of the reason why we do this is really to try to attain states of peacefulness, states of calm. We've been told it can better our life. And in the next episode, we'll talk even about the neuroscience behind what meditation can do for you. But in this episode, I want to talk about why what you're doing is not meditation, and why the word meditation is actually not even the right word for what we should be using. And that's half the issue. So let me explain a little bit further. One of the things that I personally love to do is I love the etymology of words. And what I've found is that a lot of individuals who are really successful at what they do, one of the things they study is words, because you have to realize that your words are the most powerful way to convey ideas to the minds of other people. But if you're not using them right, there may be misconveyances. There may be certain things that people misconstrue, and meditation is one of them. And let me explain a little bit more about why meditation is one of them. So when we look at the idea of the definition of meditation, what actually is the definition of meditation? I mean, think about it. I'm sure there's a million different definitions, but the one that I'll give you is just the one I pulled off of Google, which is to think deeply or focus one's attention for a period of time. That doesn't really say a whole lot, right? Let's break it down for a second. To think deeply. Okay, so when I'm in meditation, is the purpose of meditation to be thinking? Probably not, right? I've been told by many people, you're not supposed to be thinking in meditation. It's supposed to be a state of no thought. Well, what the heck does that even mean, right? Because meditation here is telling me that I'm supposed to think deeply. So either I have the wrong definition for meditation, or meditation is supposed to be something where I'm thinking deeply. And spoiler alert, it's not supposed to be something when you're thinking deeply. So let's go on to the other part, to focus one's attention for a period of time. Now, again, this one, it makes a little bit more sense, right? We do understand that in meditation, we focus our attention for a period of time. But again, what are we supposed to focus our attention on? So this is part of the problem, right? The part of the problem is that we're looking at this definition of meditation as thinking deeply or focusing one's attention for a period of time, and then we get frustrated and upset when we sit down for meditation and our thoughts start running and we can't seem to collect them and we can't seem to reel in our focus or our attention. But again, when we look at this definition of meditation, some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't make sense. So let's shift it a little bit. Let's go to something even further back. Let's go to the Latin definition, which is meditare. Now, for meditare, it says to think over, to reflect, or consider, right? So this is the idea of thinking over something, of reflecting on something, or considering it, really, really trying to chew on it in the mind. But once again, we've been told with meditation, you're not supposed to be thinking. So why is it that all of these definitions are telling us to think? I'll explain in just a minute. So what we have to look at with this definition, meditare, that comes from Latin, is that there's a greater meaning behind it. And the greater meaning has nothing to do with the way that we use meditation. The greater meaning behind this is really the idea of planning or devising or studying. So think about it. If the idea of meditare is not about a state of no thought, but it's actually about a state of intense thought on a particular subject, then why are we saying that meditation should be a state of no thought? And we're going to go into this a bit further. So I hope you're ready. When we look at this idea of meditare, meditare comes from the Greek perspective, and the Greek perspective is melete. Now, melete is the idea of a mental exercise in thought. So if we run the train line, right, from meditation, thinking deeply, to meditare, which is the idea of planning, devising, or really thinking over and reflecting, to melete, which is a mental exercise in thought. Now we're starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together and say, well, wait a minute. All three of these definitions are saying you should be thinking a whole freaking lot in meditation, which you shouldn't be. Spoiler alert. But what they are saying is that the word meditation is being used improperly for the practice that we are trying to do. So let's go a little bit deeper on this for a second. If we look at the whole idea of where melody comes from, melody is one of the three different muses in Greek. Now, who are the three muses? Well, the three muses were a way that was conceptualized of how people created great works of art in Greece. So the idea is that for the Greeks, there were three different muses that came to them that allowed them to be able to produce great works of art. So let's talk about this for a second because it's really important, and I'll explain why it's important in just a second. It's important because we have these three muses. We have melody, which is the idea of mental thought, but it's really translating to practice. That's what melody translates to. We have mnemi, which is actually where we get the root for the word memory from, and that has to do with reflection. And then we have aidi, which translates to song, which is really about vocalization. Now, why is this so important? Well, the reason why this is so important is because we have to look at what's actually being said here. See, you have to understand that when it came to the Greeks, what they were really trying to explain with the idea of melody, mnemi, and aidi was the cognitive process that we go through in terms of learning and actually taking an action on a new skill. Because what you have to understand is that art, the concept of art in Greek, isn't what we think of as art. We think of art as painting and sculpture and so on and so forth. What the Greeks looked at art as was the word techne. Now, techne is actually where we get the word technology from. It's techne and ology, which is the study of, right? But techne means art, but the greater colloquial meaning for it is really about the idea of skill, craft, or technique. So what we're saying is these three muses, these three aspects, and spoiler alert, these three aspects of our mental and cognitive process, the way our brain actually works, which I'll explain in a second, these three aspects are what create our ability to learn a skill or a craft. Now, this is why this is so important, because when we actually look at the brain, we have to understand that these three aspects, this practice, this memory, and this song, right? This mental thought, this reflection, and this vocalization are three different parts of our learning or our cognitive process. So the first one we see as practice or mental thought, right? This is the stimuli, the external stimuli that we get that comes into our brain. And when that external stimuli ends up coming into our brain, the next thing that happens once that external stimuli hits our brain is that we have a reflection about it. So it starts in the hindbrain and then it moves to the middle of the brain, the middle of the head. And in the midbrain, we start to reflect upon what it is that we actually took in through our senses. Once we reflect upon it, which is the neocortex processing, then we move into the song or the vocalization, which is our prefrontal cortex, the front of our head, and that is where we form our action. Now, the interesting part about this is that the Greeks understood something that neuroscience didn't understand for quite a while longer, and that was that when we're looking at this idea of the learning process, right? When we look at the idea of aidi, when we look at the idea of this vocalization, the area that lights up when we vocalize something or think about vocalizing something is in the prefrontal cortex. Now, the reason why this is important is because what they were doing was not talking about meditation in the way that we talk about meditation now. What they were doing was explaining how you learn a skill and then act upon that skill and take an action to bring that skill out into the world. So let's reel this back for a second. And I want you to really think about this. The reason I want you to think about this is because if the definition of meditation is sit down on a pillow, right, and throw on some music and incense and close your eyes and try to just be with yourself and try to just om your way to enlightenment, right? If that's the purpose of the word meditation, then what the Greeks are talking about is something entirely different, and what Latin is talking about is entirely different, and what English is talking about is entirely different. So maybe what's actually happening is that the word meditation doesn't mean sitting on a pillow. It doesn't mean incense. It doesn't mean oming yourself to enlightenment. It doesn't mean any of those things. What meditation means is going through the cognitive process of thinking deeply and contemplating things to create new ideas. Now, I want you to look at this from the perspective of how it was used in 16th century, 17th century literature, right? Let's say something like meditations of the heart, right? What is meditations of the heart from that perspective? Meditations of the heart from that perspective is thinking deeply about these ruminations or thinking deeply about these aspects of the heart, of love. Has nothing to do with sitting down on a pillow. Has nothing to do with oming yourself to enlightenment. It doesn't have to do with any of that stuff. So this is where we start to understand that the word meditation has actually now been hijacked as something that it was never supposed to be related to. Meditation was supposed to be a cognitive process that we went through to learn new skills and learn new things about ourselves. So meditation was really more about the idea of picking up a book and looking at it earnestly and questioning it and really starting to meditate on all of the words that are inside of it. It was about going to a concert and meditating on the beauty of the music and what created that beauty. That's what meditation is. So again, if that's the case, then meditation as we do it is not meditation. And what we're doing is something entirely different. So what the heck is it that we are actually doing? If we're not meditating, what should we call it? Well, I want you to think about a different kind of perspective of what meditation could be. And for that, we're going to have to go a little bit further east than Greece or any of those other areas. So I want to look at the yogic tradition. And the reason I want to look at the yogic tradition is because the yogic tradition has a very different word for meditation. One of their words for meditation is called dhyana. Now, dhyana is just a form of meditation. When you look at it initially, it'll say, oh, dhyana equals meditation. And then you go a little bit further and you realize dhyana does not equal meditation. And in the proper circles of yogic traditions, if you say dhyana is meditation, they'll say, well, you're kind of right, you're kind of wrong. And they'll give you kind of the whole spiel that I just gave you in terms of what meditation actually means and how that's not the proper definition for what we're talking about. So let's look at the idea of dhyana though. What does dhyana actually mean? Because it's closer to what we are trying to do, but there's a very, very important point that I'll get to in a moment of why dhyana is not the first step and why we're not even remotely close to dhyana. So dhyana can be broken down into two different aspects etymologically, which again, as you guys know, I love the whole idea of etymology. So there's di, which is thought. And really, when we look at it, it's not thought, it's intelligence or understanding. If we break it down further, it goes into the idea of our inner voice, our inner intelligence, our guidance. Another word that's sometimes used for it is buddhi, which really, when we look at the idea of buddhi, we can also see the word bud inside of it or seed, which is interesting because then when we think about this idea of the 1,000-petaled lotus that we're supposed to experience, where does that come from? It comes from a seed, right? Which is buddhi, which is the whole idea of that essence of that inner voice, that inner intelligence. You could even go as far as to say that inner God. That's what we're talking about here. So di is that inner God or that inner voice. Now, yana is vehicle. So let's think about this for a second. Dhyana means the idea of the vehicle of the inner voice, or the vehicle of our inner God, or the vehicle of our inner spark. So when we look at dhyana, there's two different aspects to dhyana. Dhyana has not only focused attention in terms of its meditation practice, but the other piece of the puzzle that dhyana has is the idea of love for creation, or love for the creator, love for God, love for Purusha, love for Guru, whatever you want to call it, right? But it's this love. Now, imagine the idea that you have decided that you want to start meditating, right? And you end up going to a conference and you end up getting like the one of the meditation apps and you open it up and the first thing that it says is like, perfect, you are ready to meditate now. You have 5 minutes before you have to go back to work. And what we're going to do is we're going to put you into a meditative state where you feel totally connected to Purusha or your God principle inside as a vehicle, and you can absorb yourself in it so fully that you reach enlightenment. Well, that would be just ridiculous. And why would it be ridiculous? Because why is it that we think that meditation should be that easy? Why is it that we think that being able to recognize all of these constructs and boxes that we've put ourselves in should be that gosh darn easy, that all we need is 5 minutes a day? And I know that not a lot of people are going to like to hear me say this, but what I have to say and what you have to realize is that all of these different apps, they're teaching you something, but it is not truthfully meditation from the deepest aspects of what meditation is. It's more like a vacation from all of your problems. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and we'll explain a little bit further soon enough why there's nothing wrong with that and why it is a step towards meditation, but it's not meditation in and of itself. So let's look at the idea of where dhyana falls in this whole concept of this Eastern yogic tradition. So dhyana is in preparation for something called samadhi. Now, what is samadhi? Well, samadhi is a state of absorption. So when we look at the idea of samadhi, the word samadhi, we would say means absorption. Another definition for samadhi or samadhi, right, is the whole idea of blow out. Now, blow out is a breathless state, and we're not going to get too far in the weeds on all of the samadhi side of things. But what I do want you to understand about samadhi is that the purpose of samadhi is to be able to experience oneness with creation. Now, when we look at the concept of enlightenment, samadhi is a stage along that path to enlightenment, but samadhi is a very high stage along that path to enlightenment. And samadhi doesn't create enlightenment as we understand from the Buddhic perspective, but what samadhi does is it prepares the ability for us to go into a state of, it prepares us to be able to go into a state of absorption, and specifically a state of absorption where our spirit is able to leave the physical body, where it becomes detached and actually merges back with the one. Now, if that wasn't too much spiritual mumbo jumbo for you, the way that we can break this down is that samadhi is a state that takes time to be able to acquire, and there are reasons physiologically behind that that we'll go into now. So dhyana is one of 8 different limbs of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. When you look at the idea of the other limbs, which we're going to go over, you'll start to understand why, yes, dhyana is an aspect of meditation, but there's a lot of other stuff that we should be doing before saying that we want to be at peace, saying that we want to reach this oneness, saying that we want to do any of the things that most people talk about with guided meditations. So the first limb of these 8 limbs, mind you, of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is something called yama. Now, yama is abstinence. And this is the first limb because the abstinence is abstaining from sensory overactivity. So think about how many times a day do you have sensory overactivity? Again, social media, sensory overactivity, right? Super loud music, or even just getting caught up in all of these emotional states, getting caught up in all of these different aspects of life is sensory overactivity. What we're trying to say is that the first stage, before we even get to meditation, before we get to anything even remotely close to that, we have to abstain from sensory overactivity. We also have to abstain from things like violence. We have to abstain from things like theft, falsehood, or acquisitiveness. What is acquisitiveness, you ask? It's an excessive interest in acquiring money or material goods. So basically, if you're chasing that green and it's the only thing you think about, that's the first thing we have to work on, right? If you're constantly compulsively buying on Amazon just to try to fill this void of what you're not getting in your life, that's the first step, not meditation, but abstinence from that. Now, here's the reason why. When we go on to the next limb of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, it's niyama, and that limb is practice. So if the first one is about abstinence, about cutting out all of these things and abstaining from all these things that hurt us truthfully, like theft, like violence. And we're not just talking about violence with others. This is what you have to understand. All of these are allegorical for things that you're doing inside of yourself. So if we break this down allegorically, when we look at the idea of violence, how much violence do you commit inside your mind on a daily basis to yourself? How many negative thoughts do you have? How many things do you say to yourself that you would never say to anybody else? That's what we're trying to abstain from, people. That's the thing we're trying to abstain from. And again, when we look at the idea of theft and falsehood, how many times do you steal away your conscious awareness from where it really should be? How many times do you steal away all of these different moments that you could be working on yourself by distracting yourself? When a difficult thought comes up, how do you steal away your consciousness and your attention from it so that you don't have to work on it, so that you don't have to see it? This is what we're talking about when it comes to theft. It's not about stealing things, because you have to understand stealing things externally only happens because we feel a sense of lack in our life. But again, that lack is what we have to work on, not the theft. The theft that we have to work on is what we're stealing within ourselves from ourselves. So when we go on to niyama, we're looking at the idea of practice. Now we've moved from the idea of abstinence. We've moved from abstaining from these things, and we've moved on to practice. And in the practice, we're looking at practicing purity, study, contentment, surrender to a higher power, austerity. And austerity is plainness or simpleness. So basically, being simple. Again, think about how many eccentric individuals out there can fully sit with themselves. And I'm not saying that every eccentric person can't sit with themselves. I've met many. But what I am saying is how many of us actually practice simpleness in our life instead of complexity? How many of us study? Now, again, in this, it's saying study the scriptures. But I want to take that into a more contemporary approach, which is just saying after you get out of high school, after you get out of college, after you get out of grad school or a doctoral program, do you continue to study? Do you continue to study in your life the things that interest you? Not to a small degree, but to a deep degree. Because what does that create? It creates practice of concentration. It creates practice of meditation, right? Because these are meditations on things we're interested in. So the study of scriptures was really about the idea of focusing concentration on things that were going to benefit us later on in this path, because all of those scriptures were allegorical. It wasn't about the whole idea of me saying, okay, I need to study this scripture because it's going to help me connect to God. No, that's not what I was saying. What was being said there was the idea that I need to study these scriptures because it's going to help me to connect to myself. Because these stories are really stories that live inside of me allegorically. And if I can understand them outside of myself, then when they present themselves, I can understand the symbols inside myself. So again, when we look at the whole idea of this practice, this comes, guys, before meditation. So right now, we've got over 8 different things that we need to focus on intensely before we start meditating if we want to be successful in our meditation practice. Now, the next one that we go on to is asana. And I'm sure most people who are listening to this, if you have even a small little bit of a spiritual spark in you, you probably know the word asana. Most people know it. And it's just the idea of body postures. But here's what's interesting, right? That's the third thing on the list. It's not the first. It's not the second. It's the third thing. So if you're going to that yoga class, hoping that you're going to reach enlightenment or really, really connect with people on a deep level, and you're not practicing yama and niyama, you may be missing the point of what the asanas are supposed to do, because the asanas are supposed to help with reorienting the body's fluids and the tissues into the proper alignment in preparation for meditation. And this happens across every single spiritual practice. You look at Buddhism, you look at Taoism, it's in every single one of those lineages. There's not a single lineage that doesn't have some sort of body practice to prepare the physical body for what's going to happen in the next higher spiritual practices. And then we have things like pranayama, which is control of the breath. So now, not only have we started abstaining from all the things that are causing this suffering in our life, but beyond that, we have also gotten to a place where we are now starting to practice these things that are beneficial for our life. We're starting to study these things that interest us in personal development. We're starting to create this sense of contentment, and we're starting to create more of a simple life for ourselves. We're getting rid of all of these things that get in the way of us seeing the peace that's naturally there when we just create that contentment. When we create a simple life around us, there's not all of this complexity that we have to worry about, and there's also not all this complexity that we get attached to, and that's the key. So then from there, we move into the idea of asana and pranayama, focusing on the body and focusing on the breath. Why? Because they're both important before we prepare for meditation. If our body is not in a place where the fluids, not to mention the tissues, are opened up properly, when we go to sit in meditation, we're going to create more complications because energy isn't going to flow properly through the body. So again, think about the idea of why you're going to that yoga class. If it's to get a workout, that's great. There's nothing wrong with going to a yoga class to get a workout, to build community, and to challenge yourself. But if you're going to a power yoga class to try to reach states of enlightenment or go into meditation, you may want to look elsewhere, because if the form doesn't follow the function, it's not going to work out the way that you want it to. Now, after this, we move into what's called pratyahara. Now, pratyahara is really important because it's the stopping of the flow of external information and turning the mind inward. Now, I want you to think about this for a second, because it's really important. You've gone through all of these other 4 different stages, and now you've gotten to this point where, through all of this, you are starting to open up to your inner awareness and to your inner senses. And the way that you're doing that is by letting go of the external stimuli and turning the focus of your consciousness inward. Now, here's the thing. If you sit down to meditation, right, which, mind you, we're not even at the stage of meditation yet. This is preparation for meditation, and we've gone through 4 different limbs. This is the 5th limb of 8 limbs, and we're still not at meditation yet. So when you look at that idea of pratyahara, what you have to understand is that it's very important to be able to do that before you go into meditation. Why? Because all of these external things are going to distract you and take your consciousness away from what it's supposed to be focusing on, which is the body, which is your inner world. And if you're not able to focus on that, then it's going to be really hard. Then it's going to be really hard for you to move on to the next stages. Now, in the next stage, it's called dharana. So what is dharana? Well, dharana is single-pointed focus. And this is what they talk about within Zen Buddhism. This is what they talk about within Taoism. This is what even some different Qigong practices teach. So the idea of that single-pointed focus is, once you're able to turn your mind, once you're able to turn your conscious awareness, turn the eye, if you will, inward. Once you're able to turn that inward, then something interesting happens. Then you start working on single-pointed focus, because once you're on the inside, what you realize is that there's a lot of things in there to sift through. And if you can't focus your mind, then how are you going to get to the state of dhyana, which is where we want to get to samadhi? So what does that focus look like? Well, if you've ever had a meditation class or listened to an app that guided you and said, I want you to bring your awareness to your breath, and you're like, oh God, this is where it all goes down. This is where it all goes south. Why? Because your mind starts wandering, and you have to bring it back, and your mind starts wandering, and you have to bring it back, and before you know it, you start getting real self-conscious and wondering, am I the only person who can't seem to freaking keep it together and just focus on my breath? And the answer is, no, you are not the only person. That's the purpose of the technique itself. See, you want to think about the idea of the mind almost like a horse. And we'll go into this in a little bit more depth in a minute here. But the reason why is because the horse is an animal. It's a beautiful, beautiful, very sentient animal. But when it's wild, it doesn't listen to you. Now, if you beat the horse is not going to become domesticated. Why? Because it doesn't trust you. Think about the idea of a parent that beats a child. Does the child trust the parent? No, the child doesn't trust the parent because it knows that it gets beaten by the parent. That doesn't develop trust. Love, compassion, serenity develops trust. So when they initially wanted to connect with these horses, they would give them things, right? It might be sugar cubes, it might be food, it might be water, to gain the confidence of the horse that they had their trust and that they were taking care of them. Now, here's the important part of this. When we start to look at this, we start to understand that if the mind is like a wild horse and I beat it with all my thoughts of judgment of why it's not doing what I want it to do, is it going to listen to me? Think about it for a second. The answer is no, but think about it within yourself. Think about how many times in your life you have said negative things to yourself and there's been a positive outcome from that. I'll wait. The answer is probably never. And there's a reason for that. It's because that wild mind of a horse, when it runs wild and it's not broken and it's not domesticated, broken meaning that it has the trust of its rider, not broken meaning that it's being beaten, but it's being broken of its wildness and it's becoming domesticated as a vehicle for transportation. Your mind is like the horse. Your consciousness, or that spark of you, that D, right, is like the rider. And the problem is, if the horse stays wild, the rider never rides it, and it just goes wherever it wants. But here's the thing, the first few times that you're going to be doing this, you know what's going to happen? You're going to sit down into meditation and you're going to say, okay, I'm going to focus on my breath. I'm going to bring my awareness to my breathing, right? And I'm just going to hold it there in that single pointed focus. And it's the same idea as me trying to call over the horse and say, here, come here, I have sugar cubes for you. And the horse is going to go, I don't know. I don't freaking know you. Why would I trust you? I'm going to go roam around. And you're going to bring the horse back a little bit. And the horse is maybe going to sniff the sugar cube and then run off again, right? And then the horse is going to come back and lick the sugar cube and then run off again. And eventually what's going to happen is that horse is going to trust you enough to stay there for more than one sugar cube, and for the second sugar cube, and for the third sugar cube, and for water. And then eventually that horse gets a harness put on it. And when you try to ride that horse is going to kick your ass off, and it's going to go bolting into the wild again. And then you're going to call it back, and you're going to go through that same exact process again. And this is the purpose of this initial stage of preparation for meditation. The purpose of this initial stage is to get the horse, to get your mind to trust you enough to ride it. And once you get to that point, that is when you are ready for dhyana. Now, we understand that dhyana is something entirely different than dharana. So what is dhyana really and truly? Dhyana is once you've gotten to this stage, once you're at this place where you can focus your mind on a single point, where you can turn your mind inward and you can focus it on a single point. Then when you reach dhyana, it is not a single point. It is just letting things be what they are. It's the understanding that as we focus the mind, we have to push everything else away. We have to say, I'm focusing on the breath, right? There's a me, there's the breath, there's me focusing on the breath. That's what I know. When I get to the stage of dhyana, it's very different because it's the understanding that the breath is just going to happen, that my mind is just going to move in different places. And what I really have to do is I have to use that sense of love and compassion that I know is deep within me, in that inner God, in that inner spark, and allow the vehicle and that inner spark to guide the experience of me just witnessing with non-judgment. Now, this witnessing with non-judgment is not something that we do consciously in the way that we think of conscious, because the problem is for most people, when they sit down to meditation, they go completely unconscious and it's just a state of sleep. And dhyana is a hyper-conscious state. You are aware of everything, but you are not judging anything. And this is the difference. In dharana, we're looking at the whole idea of that single pointed focus and we are holding on to those reins and that horse is going freaking wild, right? In dhyana, we are sitting atop that horse, but that horse is not moving really. And we're not, in truth, really sitting on top of that horse. We're letting that horse be because we recognize that ultimately the mind was never tamed and the mind was never untamed. We were simply just observing it. So dhyana is really a state of observation, of hyper-conscious observation of all things that are going on without attaching to anything. It's a non-doing state. And this is where we're going to cut off, because when we get to the whole idea of samadhi, let's face it, most of us are not ready for samadhi, because samadhi is a state that goes beyond that. Samadhi is a state of complete absorption where there is no understanding of me or myself anymore. There just is. And yet at the same time, there is a me, but it's not the me that I think of. It's a release of that me coming to something higher, which is just being creation and a part of creation and an aspect of creation. And we're not going to go there because there's no point to it. And the reason why there's no point is because the mind wants what it cannot have. And the problem is the more that it is wanted, the less that it can be received. So if that made sense to you, then good, you're on that path. And if it didn't make sense to you, start at step 1 and you'll get there eventually, I promise. But what we have to look at is, okay, so if this isn't where I should start, if I'm not ready for dhyana yet, if I'm not ready for samadhi yet, if I'm not even ready for dharana yet, then where the heck should I start? I mean, if I'm not ready for meditation, then what am I supposed to do? And what I want to talk about now is the idea of mindfulness that comes from Buddhist practices. So mindfulness is a form of meditation. It's a preparation for meditation, but it's a form of meditation because remember, we have to understand that the word meditation is not dhyana, it's not dharana, it's not samadhi. Meditation is just thoughtful. Meditation is thoughtfulness, it's concentration, it's contemplation, it's reflection. So again, this is a mindfulness practice for reflection, for contemplation, and for deep thought about oneself. Now, mindfulness has been talked about in 6 ways to Sunday, but I'm going to sum it up for you really, really simple. Mindfulness is just about being aware. So the question is, how aware are you of yourself on a daily basis? I want you to just take a second and I want you to close your eyes as long as you're not driving. If you're driving, do not close your eyes. This is not a recommendation to close your eyes if you're driving. But if you're not driving, if you're not in a place where you're operating heavy machinery or where anything could get injured or damaged from you closing your eyes, and only you're going to know that to be true. But again, some good key points are if you're driving, if you're operating a crane, or if you're running a marathon, probably don't close your eyes. Then again, you probably should also be focused on what you're doing and not listening to a podcast that goes this deep into stuff. So if you're not doing that, close your eyes. And what I want you to think about is I want you to think about this idea of how often you're aware of yourself. Really sit with it for a second and ask yourself, how aware am I that I'm alive? How aware am I that I'm in a body? How aware am I of where I am in space and time throughout my day? Day to day, how often do I check in with the fact that I'm in a body, with the fact that I'm feeling things, with the fact that I'm alive and I'm breathing? And for most of you, what you're probably going to find is not that often. And that's okay, because that's the starting point. But meditation, from the standpoint of sitting down and trying to reach dhyana, isn't going to get you there. What's going to get you there is mindfulness. So here's a couple of different ideas of what we can do to be more mindful. The first thing is throughout our day, we start asking ourselves, how aware am I of where I am right now? How aware am I of what I'm doing right now? Where are my thoughts? We start questioning ourselves as if we don't know. And here's the reason why. It's very easy for me to say that I know where I am. If I'm in a dream state, for instance, and I'm dreaming, right? And there's all these things that are happening around me. There's this dragon that's like spitting fire that turns into this soda that I end up drinking. And then there's someone to my left who looks kind of like a goat man woman with a dress on that's like, how was your day today, Waylon? And I'm like, oh, Marcy, good to see you again. It was great. Now I'm drinking soda, but it kind of looks like it's a sludge. That's weird. Maybe I'm the sludge, and then I become the sludge. And here's the strange part about this, guys. The strangest part about this is not the experience itself, and no, that's not an experience I've had. That's just one that I made up on the fly. But the craziest part about this is that you, for some reason, did not know that something was weird. Now think about that. How many times have you been in a dream, and you've awoken only to be like, wow, that was so weird. How is it that I didn't know that I was dreaming? How is it that I could have possibly thought that something like that was really happening? This is the understanding of how we break out of the matrix, guys. How we break out of the matrix is by recognizing that it's a construct that has many, many fallacies in it, that it's a construct that is not what we think it is. And again, this comes to the whole idea of your sense of self. What you have to understand is that if you're not consciously aware from moment to moment, and most of us are not, I'll admit that there's a lot of time in my life when I am not as consciously aware as I could be. And now note, I'm not saying should be, because remember, we're not trying to beat the horse. We're trying to befriend the horse. So there are many times where I'm not as conscious as I could be. And because of that, I have no awareness of what I'm actually feeling. Heck, I have no awareness of where I even am in space because my mind is somewhere entirely different. So mindfulness is the ability for us to start to bring our conscious awareness back to the present moment. You want to be in the present, then put yourself there. You want to experience peace and contentment and all these other things, then start to create it in your life by actually looking at what your life is, by becoming consciously aware and mindful of what the experience of living actually means. So how do we do this? Well, a couple of different ways that we can do this that are really, really easy. The first thing is just become aware. Ask yourself, how aware am I of myself, right? And then start to break it down more. Start to look at, in each and every moment, where are my desires? Where are my thoughts? What are my behaviors, right? We say hindsight is 20/20, but I disagree with this because that's saying that we can only have clarity after the event has happened. I really think that hindsight is the easy 20/20, but truthfully, presence is the difficult 20/20, but it's the real 20/20. It's the one that we don't need glasses for. It's the one we don't need a prescription for. It's the one where we have clear eyes from the start because we're seeing ourselves for who we actually are, not who we wish we were or who we'd like to be or who we're afraid of or any of these other distortions. We are seeing ourselves clearly in the present moment by being in the present moment. So when you start to look at this, some of the different ways that we can find mindfulness is by becoming aware of things. For instance, mindful breathing. How aware are you on a daily basis of your breath? And I'm not talking about the idea of saying take a couple of deep breaths, though that is very beneficial. I'm just talking about bringing your awareness to the fact that you are a breathing being and feeling what it feels like to inhale and exhale just as you naturally would inhale and exhale, not trying to make anything different happen, but just taking note of what's already there. That's mindful breathing. And again, you don't need to sit down, you don't need incense, you don't need an app to do that. All you need is what you already have, which is being a breathing person who has a conscious awareness that can focus on particular things. So mindful breathing. Mindful eating is another really big one. And here's why mindful eating is a big one. When we look at the idea of how we eat, most of us eat subconsciously. Now, I will admit, I am the type of person who will eat and watch a Netflix show. Yes, I am the type of person who will do that. But I'm also the type of person who will sit down and take an hour to eat a very small bowl of food as a practice of mindful eating. This is what we have to understand about this non-dual representation. If we don't judge ourselves for what we do, then we actually start to enjoy life. I want you to think about just for a second, how many of you have eaten a piece of dessert in the past week and felt bad about it while you were eating it? I know that there are a lot of people that I've talked to, and for myself, I did this for quite a while, and I didn't have any eating disorders or any type of body dysmorphia. Well, that's a lie. I did have body dysmorphia, but it was a little bit different. We won't go into that. It was bigorexia, so it was the opposite. I felt that I was a lot smaller than I actually was, so I crammed food. Needless to say, I've known a lot of different people who eat desserts and feel bad about eating desserts. Now, here's what's weird about that. When I think about the idea of feeling bad about eating desserts, the question that comes to mind is why eat the dessert in the first place? So when you're looking at mindful eating is a practice of becoming aware of all of the different sensory information that's coming into you when you're eating. And that doesn't start with when the food hits your stomach or when you get your second plate. That starts with whenever the food first is exposed to you. So it might be the idea of you're out at a restaurant and the first part of mindful eating is just becoming aware of the experience of being in the restaurant, right? And just using this example, we'll kind of continue down that tunnel line. So you go to the restaurant and you sit down, you start to notice the sounds around you, you start to notice the music that's playing, you start to notice the person that you're having dinner with, the conversation that's going on. You taste the water, but you look at the water first, and it might just be simple water. But can you glean something different from it than you normally would by being more present than you normally are? And as you go throughout this entire meal, each and everything is done intentionally, not habitually. And the reason why is because you start to recognize, whoa, when the food comes out and the plate initially gets, passed my way by the server, I start to get a waft of the smell of the food, and I start to salivate, and I start to have all these memories that come up of different times when I had something similar. And maybe those memories are good, maybe those memories are bad. It's not for us to judge them, it's just for us to experience them. And as we continue to experience further and further, we take each and every one of our bites intentionally. Why? Because we start to notice that the slower that we eat, the more that we slow down, the more that there is to life. In many cases, a lot of the things that you are wanting in life that you feel like you're missing out on are not actually things. It's the time that you are taking to experience that thing that is already there. And that's the problem, guys. For most of us, we're in a place where we don't understand that most of what we are lacking is really just in our awareness of what's already there. And if we just brought our awareness to the present moment, we wouldn't feel that sense of lack. We'd feel contentment, which means ding, 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 congratulations. You'd already be on the second limb of the 8 limbs of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So mindful eating can be a way to do this, but we can take this further. What about mindful communication? How many times in your life have you had a conversation with someone and either you or that person was like, this person is not listening to me in any way, shape, form. I could say literally whatever I want and they are not aware. So here's a fun social experiment, right? The next time that someone tells you or says, hey, how you doing today? Tell them how you're actually doing. Now, I've done this before and I've gone crazy with it, right? Because again, I wasn't always in a very, very good mental space. So I remember there was a time not too long ago where someone, I think it was at a bank or something, asked me like, how you doing today? And I was like, oh, not really good. I feel like this is kind of maybe going to be my last day on earth. And you know what they said to me? They were like, great, how about you? And just walked away. Now, think about that for a second. They did not listen in any way, shape, form. They were on a program. They were just doing the habitual thing. And we all do it, guys. If you don't think that you do it, take your non-dominant hand and for the next week, try to only open doors with your non-dominant hand. And I guarantee you'll make it a couple of days and then you'll forget about it. This is how habitual we are. So how do we fix this habituality? Well, mindfulness. Mindful communication is not just about the idea of active listening or reflective listening or any of those things. It's about really being present with what it is that you're feeling and what it is that you're hearing from that other person. And spoiler alert, sometimes when you do this, you may feel really intense emotions that you didn't feel before. You may feel deeply connected to this person like they're the love of your life or your soulmate. And in some cases they may be, but caution, in most cases it's not. In most cases, it's just all of that connection that you are missing out on by not actually having any skin in the game consciously when you're in spaces with people. So mindful connection and mindful communication is one aspect of this. Another aspect is mindful working. Now, I know everybody on here is probably going to be like, you telling me I have to be aware that I hate my job? And the answer is yes. And the reason why I say that is not because you have to be aware of what you hate about your job. You have to be aware of what it is that you're doing for your job, because your job is one of the easiest ways to go on autopilot. I could very easily, as I'm doing this podcast, be at a place where I can just go on autopilot and I just talk and I'd ramble and I do all these things and I wouldn't be present for any of it, which means that I wouldn't be present with all of you that are present with me right now. And who is that doing service to? No one. So again, when you look at the idea of your work, I promise you that if you become more mindful of your work, you're going to become better at your work and you're actually going to enjoy your work a lot more. And there's neuroscience behind that we'll go into, but not today. This is going to be for another episode. But what I'm saying here is that mindfulness at work is arguably, in a way, almost more important than mindfulness in any of those other settings. Because yes, we do a lot of breathing. Yes, we do a lot of eating. Yes, we do a lot of communication. But let's face it, guys, we are a work first, live second society. And most of the people here, they work themselves to the bone. So if you've got all that time and you've got all of those experiences and all of those possibilities, why would you not hack that to your advantage? Why would you not game that to your advantage to get to a place where you could simply say, wow, I am using my work each and every single day to better myself on this path towards meditation and towards understanding the deeper aspects of who I am and what life actually is, just simply by being present at my work and being mindful of what it is that I'm doing. I'm rewriting the way that all of this programming and habituation came up so that I can show up to work as the best person that I am every single day because I'm present with who that person is. And that's the key. And the final one that I'll say is mindful relaxing. Mindful relaxation. Now, this is one that's a little bit of a hot topic. And here's the reason why this is such a hot topic. This is such a hot topic because most people feel like when they relax, they shouldn't have to think about anything. They shouldn't be aware of anything. They should just, right? It's like a vacation. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to experience it. I do want to experience it, but I don't want to have to think about it or make it something, right? Well, what you have to understand is that mindfulness is not about making anything that it's not. What mindfulness is about is bringing your awareness to what it is that you're actually doing. And if you think about it, wouldn't it be better if we understand when it comes to mindful eating and mindful breathing and mindful communication and mindful working, that all of these things make what we are doing better? Why is it that we think that mindful relaxation wouldn't be better than unconscious, habitual relaxation? Because here's the funny part, guys, and here's the spoiler alert. You may find that some of the things that you do for relaxation are not actually that relaxing when you're really aware of what it is. So again, I'll use the example of Netflix and something that I've come to experience with Netflix. Way back in the day when I was a child, as many children did, when I got sick, I was like, TV. I'm just going to watch TV, right? And so I would watch TV. And when I got sick, that was the thing that I did. I watched TV and it helped me feel so much better. And I would watch hours of TV. I'd watch That's So Raven and all these other shows, right? But I would watch hours of TV. And I would get to this point, usually around the 6 or 7 hour mark, where I was like, man, I feel so depleted, but I'm sick. So that's the reason why, right? Now, fast forward to when I was in my early 20s, I started practicing mindfulness and I started watching TV mindfully. And here's what I found. TV takes from me more than it gives from me. That's just me personally. But when I ended up getting sick and I went into this mindfulness practice, I tried to watch TV and I was like, I cannot watch TV when I'm sick if I am present. And that's when I started to realize something really important, which was I didn't watch TV to become connected to my body. I watched TV to escape my body. Now, here's the question that I want to ask all of you guys. What is it that you do for relaxation that is really more about you escaping what it is that you feel than getting in touch with what you feel? And the reason why this is so important is because if relaxation and rejuvenation are supposed to be things that recharge us, then why do we think that it should be something where we move outside and away from our body to recharge? Again, if I'm in a place where I simply say, I am really, really hungry, right? I'm super depleted of nutrients and I need food. But what I want you to do is I want you to just take the food and I want you to just throw it in the other direction. Is that going to nourish me? Well, no, it's not going to nourish me at all. I didn't eat any food, right? That's simple as pie. Of course we know that. But what's the difference between that and me saying, oh man, I had a really, really difficult day. You know what? I just need to sit down and watch 4 hours of TV that's going to jump up and jack my nervous system, that's going to get me into all of this different emotional turmoil, and it's going to allow me to escape into this story so I don't have to sit with the fact that I don't understand why I'm living a life with a job that is causing me so much fatigue. Now, what's more important? Escaping or actually dealing with our problems? Because when we get to meditation, right, which remember, this is in preparation for meditation. When we get to meditation, we have to deal with our problems, guys. There is no more escape because again, we've taken all of these different steps. We've taken the absence, we've taken the practice, we've taken all of the different body exercises, we've taken the single pointed focus. And when we get to the end of it, what we start to realize is, oh man, this entire path was about me dealing with my shit. And if I don't deal with my shit, then nothing's going to change. That's the key here. So mindfulness is a practice of becoming aware of what's coming up in our life and getting real clear about how we actually feel about these different situations and these different things that are going on in our life. Because once we become aware of them, then we can shift them. And we shift them through that compassion. We shift them through the ability to get the mind to trust us enough, just like that horse, that we can ride it and steer it in a direction that's going to be beneficial for the entire tribe that is our collective neurology, that is our collective mind, body, and soul. So what I want to leave you with when it comes to this whole idea of mindfulness and really wrapping this up into a nice tight little bow is that when we're looking at the idea of meditation in the truest sense of what the word meditation means is about preparation for things like dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, which are something entirely different. So if we want to learn how to meditate, we need to start with things like mindfulness. We need to start with things like abstaining from this violence that we create within ourselves. All of these different negative impulses that we have, all of these different behaviors. We need to start really studying all of the things that interest us in personal development to a high degree. We need to focus our mind and we need to reach the full potential, guys, of what it is that we're capable of. Because you are so much smarter and you are so much more capable than you believe that you are. And that's half of the reason why you're in your own way right now. So we need to get to this place where we can understand how to let go of our baggage so that we can really reach who it is that we know deep down we can actually be. And once we do that, we need to learn how to take care of our body and how to take care of our mind. If you're not sleeping well, then you are not going to do good in meditation. If you're not eating well, then you are not going to do good in meditation. And ultimately, what I've found with most of the people that I work with is the reason why they want to meditate is so they can fix all those problems. But they're not going to be able to meditate until they fix those problems. So start with those things that upset you. And I promise you that if you start to actually work on pulling out all of those weeds and getting to the roots of these things that frustrate you in life, of this suffering, if you will, eventually you'll get to a place where meditation is something that's possible. But it starts with mindfulness. And don't get me wrong, mindfulness is extremely powerful because you have to understand that when you start to get to a place where you are accepting things without this sense of judgment, when you are getting into this place where you're connecting to the present moment, one thing that happens that's really interesting is something called your default mode network shuts off. Now that's your sense of self. That's the thing that's the constant talking inside of your head. And through this idea of mindfulness, we can get to a place where we shut that off. And in the next episode, we'll go into the neuroscience behind what the default mode network is, why it's running your life, and why it doesn't have to run your life if you start to become more present and aware of what's going on in your life and start to take this path towards meditation, towards dharana, towards dhyana, towards samadhi, and towards these heightened states of awareness. We'll go into that as well as going into some of the neuroscience behind meditation and really helping you to understand how you can implement these aspects, these key aspects and practices in your everyday life in a way that's going to be right for you and in a way that you're going to succeed instead of fail like you have in the past. So the last thing that I basically want to leave you with as a closing thought is really looking at the idea of how mindful you are throughout your day, and asking yourself each moment, am I in the driver's seat of my life or am I in the passenger seat of my life? So the last thing that I want you to think about, I want you to ask yourself the question, how mindful am I of where I am right now? How mindful am I even of just watching this video? Am I aware of what it is that I'm seeing? Am I aware of what it is that I'm taking in? Or am I just kind of off to the side? And really think about, in the next few days, are you in the driver's seat of your life or are you still stuck in the passenger seat? So I hope this helped you with understanding meditation to a deeper degree. And in the next episode, we'll go into the neuroscience behind meditation and give you a real deep understanding of what's actually going on in the brain so you can practically apply this to your life. So I really enjoyed having some time with you. Remember to stay curious, and I'll see you in the next episode.